want to know deep reality. I've focused on cosmology and consciousness, but I take seriously the potential existence of God, or something like God, if there be such a being. My approach has been generally analytical, philosophy of religion style, examining the nature, essence, and traits of God, if there be a God. I've generally not considered sectarian doctrines, the specific God claims of diverse religions, but in my avoidance have I limited my scope. In the West, Christianity is so common that our ears have become dull to its astonishing, some would say preposterous claims. Is God triune, a trinity? Is one God three persons? How could one be three, or three be one? The notion, to be charitable, does not strike me as obvious, perhaps not even coherent. Yet very smart thinkers, philosophers hold this belief. What arguments do they pose? One need not be a Christian or even a theist to appreciate clever moves of logic and linguistics in humanity's search for deep reality. What's the Trinity? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and Closer to Truth is my philosophical inquiry. The Trinity, how could one God be three persons? I can't allow the numbing repetition of the term Trinity to obscure its disruptive assertion. What's to be learned from its strivings for coherence? Should I immerse myself in the world of philosophical theology, feel what it's like to think like a Christian philosopher? I visit one of the world's leading centers for philosophical and analytical theology, Scotland, St. Andrews University, the Logos Institute. I begin with a leader in metaphysics and philosophy of religion, a past president of the Society of Christian Philosophers, Notre Dame philosopher Peter van Inwagen. Peter, the Christian claim of God gets you immediately to a Trinity, which, if I'm sitting back and thinking about the structure of reality, seems pretty bizarre. What are these three things that compose one God?
I promise you I will answer that question. But I want to begin with
I'm impressed by that.
Assuming that there is a God, why did he bother to make a world? That is, why did he bother to create anything besides himself? Now, Jews and Muslims have a very good answer. So that love could exist between persons, so that there could be persons who love each other. And there could be persons who cooperate to do things for each other. All these good interpersonal relationships could not exist if there were only one person, the divine person in the world. But, of course, that does imply that there are goods that are not inherent in God's nature. The Christian doctrine says that all goods are inherent in God's nature. Not only is there one person who loves another, even if there was no creation, then there would even be two persons cooperating to do something for a third person. All these goods exist full and perfect and complete inside God, so that everything that happens and all the goods of interpersonal relations that happen in the created world are a kind of copy of these. This leaves Christians without any answer to the question, why would God bother to create anything? It's a mystery. But it does leave Christians in possession of the doctrine that all goods are actually to be found in the divine nature.
Without God having to create.
That is, you can't both have an explanation of why God would create and also have everything inside that goodness for the total reality, goodness of reality would need inside God's nature. And Christians end up having the one, and the Jews and the Muslims have the other. But how is this possible? That is, the Muslims in particular, Jews might be more polite on this, but both believe that the Christians are tritheists. They believe in three gods, and the Christians insist that they believe in one God, but That's not very believable, is it? How could there be three persons in one God? Because each of them is a divine person. Each of them is God. One way around this mystery is to think that there might be no such thing as just counting, but rather counting by. If it's the Christian, I mean, how many gods are there? One way for the Christian answer was, well, there isn't any unique answer to that question. What do you want me to count them by? Mm-hmm. You use the word God, so maybe you want me to count them by gods. That is, by divine beings. Oh, in that case, there's one. But do you want me to count them by persons? Well, there are three then. And if you think that's contradictory, that's because you think there's such a thing as absolute counting.
If you really believe that there are these three centers of consciousness, the three persons, and go, why do you care if somebody calls it monotheism or tritheism? What do you care?
We Christians are children of the Jews. They are our parents. We believe in their God. It is their God who has become, we believe, incarnate in Jesus Christ, and whose triune nature revealed to us later. There can't be anything more stark than the insistence of the Hebrew Bible that there is one God. It is extremely important to us that there is one God. But we find it in our tradition revealed to us that there are three.
Peter posits that for God to have within God's own self intrinsically all perfections, including love, God must consist of three persons, because love is a social contract requiring interrelationships. Such reasoning is derived from what's called perfect being theology, analyzing God's traits as nothing greater can be imagined. But why should God, if there is a God, conform to human notions of strict, perfect beingness? Moreover, does Peter's explanation hold with only a particular kind of Trinity, a so-called social Trinity, where the three persons that compose the Trinity have separate centers of consciousness with independent wills and intents? But are there other kinds of Trinities? I meet a professor of systematic theology, a pioneer of analytic theology, a fellow at St. Andrews, Oliver Crisp.
At the heart of the doctrine is the idea that God is one in essence, but three in person. That is, there's Father and a Son and the Spirit. And these three are distinct, though they share somehow in one divine essence. One model says, well, in a way, these three are something like relations. Subsistent relations is the term that St. Thomas Aquinas uses. So the Father and Son and the Holy Spirit are one and can only be differentiated in virtue of the fact that they bear these relations to one another, being begotten of the Father, being spirated by the Father and the Son, perhaps, and being ingenerate or not being generated by anybody. That's the Father. So just the relations distinguish the person. Well, another option is to say that what you've got is a much more robust sense of distinctness. You've got Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and they're persons in this sense that they have each a center of will and consciousness, and so they can make decisions together. And then they're one in the sense that, let's say, three human beings are instances of the one thing, humankind. That's sometimes called a social view of the Trinity. The first one's sometimes called a Latin view of the Trinity or a psychological view of the Trinity. Yeah. Emphasizes the oneness, and this second view emphasizes the distinctness or the threeness. But the worry is that you so emphasize the threeness that it's not sufficient to retain monotheism, which is what you want to have if you want to remain part of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And some Christian theologians have been happy to bite that bullet, but that seems to be, to my way of thinking, to be too great a cost. So it's not clear to me that the different families of views out there of trying to understand the Trinity ultimately work. My own view is what I would think of as a kind of Trinitarian Mysterianism. In other words, it is a mystery, I acknowledge it's a mystery, I confess the doctrine at the heart of it. How do we make sense of that? I'm not exactly sure. I don't have a clear idea of, and I'm not sure that anybody has a clear idea of.
What about the idea that these three things are sort of different faces of the same thing?
Right, now that is what's known as a Trinitarian heresy, or a mistaken view that the Church has distanced distance itself from, which is called modalism. And modalism is the view that you've got basically one God who wears three different masks on three different occasions. You might think of the difference between, Batman and Bruce Wayne. They're both the same entity, but one wears a mask and one doesn't. But you're talking about the same individual. Now, the problem with that is it's insufficient. It's insufficient in the sense that you don't have a robust sense of persons. What you just have is one entity. So that's not Trinitarian.
If the reality is there are three gods, I don't care if there's a monotheism or not. That's what it is, it is. But what bothers me is some of the internal contradictions, because if it's God, it has to be either everlasting or atemporal. But in that case, how can you have a father and a son? Begotten is sort of part of a kind of a temporal process, which indicates if you're begotten, what were you before you were begotten?
And I think what we're dealing with here is what's sometimes called anthropomorphism. That is the sense in which we're trying to project beyond ourselves onto God language that we have, that we use in other human contexts. And I think what Christian theologians have sought to do is do the best they can with the limitations that we have.
Oliver describes a Latin or psychological trinity defined in terms of relations, which starts with God being one, God's oneness, in contrast with a social trinity, which starts with God being three, God's threeness. Personally, if forced to choose, I'd go with Oliver's own Trinity Mysterianism. I relish the linguistic gymnastics because they portray the mighty maneuvers we humans undertake to support our theological beliefs. I bet there be more kinds of trinities out there. I meet the director of the Center for Philosophy of Religion at Notre Dame, a pioneer in analytic theology, Michael Ray. Can analytic theology justify a trinity?
Here's the analogy I like. Suppose I take a piece of clay and I make a statue of Gumby. Then I ask you, what's the relationship between Gumby and the piece of clay? And you might say, well, they're the same thing. But I say, well, now look, the piece of clay existed before Gumby. Something can't exist before itself, right? So they're different. Are they two different things? If I'm gonna sell it, can I sell you Gumby and then charge you extra for the piece of clay? No. But the solution I like says, well, here's the relationship between Gumby and the piece of clay. They are the same, but not identical. They're one in number, but not one in being. Where you have two things sharing the same matter, you count one material object, right? My fist and my hand, right? There's one object here. The fist goes away when I open my hand. The hand doesn't go away. So in some sense, they're two separate things. This relationship is all over the place. So Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, I want to say the shared matter is the divine nature. Their relationship is analogous to the fist in the hand or Gumby and the piece of clay.
The fact that they are centers of consciousness, I think that's a fair term. I haven't wandered into a heresy by saying that, have I?
Depends a little on who you ask, but I think that's fine.
So if they're each centers of consciousness, it sounds like that undermines the argument that they have the same nature. When each one becomes a center of consciousness, and then the claim is that they're all the same stuff, I think that's problematic.
I don't think the divine nature is literally stuff, right? So there's that. I do want to affirm that there is different consciousness there. The tradition says that Father, Son, and Holy Spirit share a will and they share an agency, but I think if they're going to be distinct persons, it has to be the case that the Father thinks things like, I am the Father and not the Son, right? The Son thinks things like, I'm the Son and not the Father. Right. So the view I'm offering says, hey, sameness isn't identity. Just as you get the same material object when you have two things that share the same matter, so too you get the same God when you have two divine beings that share a divine nature. And then if you say, well, but how could those beings have different centers of consciousness? I think I'm within my rights to say, I don't know, but I also don't see an argument for the conclusion that they can't.
Do you have a name for this theory?
It's ended up being called Constitution Trinitarianism. Material constitution is the relationship between two things that share all of their material parts in common.
Michael's constitutional Trinity stresses common essence as the core unifier. Frankly, after all the parsing and nuance, which I admire and enjoy, I'm left with the simple sense that the three whatevers still struggle to be counted as monotheism. For all I know, the Trinity may indeed be ultimate reality, but to me, what can I say? The Trinity just doesn't square with one God. So something would have to give, either loosen one's grip on one God or weaken one's hold on the Trinity. Neither is nice for traditional Christians. Are there other ways for a kind of Trinity to be really one God? I asked the former professor of the philosophy of the Christian religion at Oxford, now at Rutgers, Brian Leftow.
One way that you can start to get an entrance to it would be from one of the prime Trinitarian texts, the beginning of the Gospel of John. We read, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Now there are two different thoughts there. The Word was with God. That means the Word and God are two different things. I am with you. We would not say that I am with myself ordinarily. On the other hand, the Word was God. Well, that's a claim of identity. And so it's as if the Word was God with God, God repeated, God a second time over. Now, one way I like to make sense of that would be in terms of time travel, to the extent that time travel does make sense. Imagine that I were to leave the room right now, travel back in time a few minutes, and then enter and stand here and sort of ask myself a question and answer myself. You'd then have Leftow with Leftow twice over. So one way I think about the Trinity is it's as if God had a life which involved something like time travel. Now, notice what's going on when I travel in time. There's one substance, there's me in two different places. There's two of something. There's two episodes of my life going on at once, because there's the earlier episode when I'm still here and I haven't time traveled, and there's the later episode when I've time traveled and I've come back in and here I am bothering myself. Sure. So if time travel is imaginable and conceivable, then it's imaginable that one person live a life in which at every time more than one episode of that life is going on. That, I think, is one way of understanding what the Trinity would be. It's God has this really odd sort of life in which he's always living three episodes of it at once. Why it would be that way, well, that's one place in which the doctrine is mysterious.
So my understanding is that the traditional Christian view is that there are really three persons, or sometimes centers of activity, in the one concept of God, but the three persons are really distinct.
When I talk to myself, there are two really distinct entities that are talking to each other. I mean, my later self might ask my earlier self a question that my earlier self didn't know was coming, because my later self might have thought it up while he was getting into and out of the time machine. So there's certainly two distinct centers of consciousness going on here. What's nice about my version of it is that it secures monotheism for the view pretty clearly. I mean, there's just the one God who's being repeated over and over again. If you start from three separate things and try and sort of build one God out of that, you wind up with a very weak sense of monotheism, and that's not how the doctrine's supposed to work. I wouldn't suspect that God was this way if I weren't a Christian and didn't accept it on a revealed ground. I'm willing to accept that there are sources of information that unaided reason wouldn't have access to.
Brian's Trinity, more than other Trinities, is strong on monotheism, good for one God. As a logical consequence, however, Brian's Trinity must be and is weak on three persons. Brian defends his views as Latin Trinitarianism, in that the three expressions of God are different centers of consciousness, even though they all come from the timeline of the one God. If Brian's Trinity reflects three faces, as it were, of the same one God, why stop at three? Isn't God supposed to be infinite? I appreciate the adroit time travel innovation. But what nomenclature gyrations? Novice that I am, I cannot much distinguish this tripartite time travel God from the long-labeled heresy, where the three persons of the Trinity are really one divine person playing three different roles. My head swirls with competing trinities, a notion of reality that, even if true, pardon me, would still seem an odd way for reality to be. I'm wondering now how to make the best case for the Trinity. I asked the emeritus philosopher of the Christian religion at Oxford, Richard Swinburne.
The doctrine of the Trinity claims that there are three divine persons, but the other two derive from the Father. The doctrine says they derive necessarily, that is to say, it's not a voluntary act of the Father's to produce the Son and the Spirit. It follows from his essence that he will do so. If we see something as the obviously best act to do, and we have no temptation to do anything else, we'll do it. So, for God too, if he sees something as the best thing to do, he, not being subject to temptations in any way, will inevitably do it. The sort of God to which arguments lead is a God who is omnipotent, omniscient, and is perfectly free. That is to say, he's free from inclinations to do things other than what he sees as a reason for doing them in virtue of their goodness. Now, if God the Father were a solitary God, if he were the only God, there would be something rather wrong, wouldn't there? People have said, surely a perfectly good God will be a perfectly loving and a perfectly generous God, but how could that be if he existed all by himself? And surely perfect goodness, perfect generosity, perfect lovingness would want to create some other being with whom to share everything he has and was. And therefore, God's perfect goodness requires him to share, and hence the need for a second person of the Trinity, given the traditional name of the Son. Now, two can be a bit selfish. It was Richard of St. Victor in the 12th century, I think, who first saw this point. He said that if you really love anyone, you will want to find someone for them to love other than yourself and to be loved by other than yourself. Otherwise, your love is selfish. You want it for your own sake. And therefore, the love of the Father for the Son would inevitably bring about a third member of the Trinity, because this would mean that each member of the Trinity would have someone else to love and be loved by other than the third member of the Trinity. That is to say, 3 is the minimum number necessary for unselfish love. And therefore, I think this is, to my mind, a strong a priori argument for the doctrine of the Trinity. There are 3 divine persons, and the 3 divine persons follow from the one person. But why only 3? Is the objection. Why stop there? And the answer is this: 3 is the minimum number necessary for unselfish love. But if there is 3, then that demand for unselfish love would be satisfied. Now, God cannot create the best of all possible worlds. Any world he creates would be less good than some world he could create, because more is better. So, if you were to say, well, wouldn't it be better if there was a 4th divine person or a 5th divine person? The answer is, well, of course, maybe it would, but then there would be no reason to stop anywhere. But in that case, God's perfect goodness would be satisfied by his creating only 3, because it's not logically possible to do the best, but it is logically possible to do the best kind of act, and the best kind of act would be to create 3 divine persons. And any 4th person would therefore be only created by a voluntary act, and someone created by a voluntary act would not be God, because he wouldn't be a necessary being. So 3 is not merely the minimum, but the maximum number for divinity.
The Christian claim that God is triune, the one God of Hebrew monotheism, is the Christian Trinity, challenges Christian philosophers. First, through faith, they accept the Trinity. Then, with logic and argument, they seek to explain, or at least to make plausible, how one God can be 3 persons. Not too much 3 persons, which would undercut one God. Not too much one God, which would undercut 3 persons. The social Trinity privileges the 3 persons. The Latin or psychological Trinity privileges the one God. Constitutional Trinity explains how three divine persons are numerically the same without being identical. Trinitarian Mysterianism, who knows how it works? I guess that's the fallback. I'm taken by Swinburne's argument for the necessary existence of three divine persons, and of only three, not because I think it's true, but because it is a masterpiece of philosophical rigor. Yet, if three fits some higher order good or principle, a kind of abstract object, then wouldn't that good or principle be more fundamental than God? The Trinity indeed has challenges. I relish them all, forgetting closer to truth.
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.